So that's one of the biggest myths I've been trying to bust over the past couple of years. And their data are publicly available, and people continue to ignore those data. So, what those data show is that when it comes to NIH funded research trials, women have made up more than 50% of participants every single year since like 1993. There's been the entire Office for Research on Women's Health dedicated towards studying women's health. There are multiple other offices that have existed, like within the FDA. And if you look at the NIH's funding data, more money is spent on female specific research than male specific research. But they continue to push this narrative, and it's just not true.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm Ryan Rogers. Joining me today from down under in Australia is Dr. James Nuzzo, who's an exercise scientist and men's health researcher, and I'm super excited for a fascinating conversation. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So start off telling us, I guess part of it will be how you got to Australia, but who are you, where you come from?
Yeah, well, I'm now a dual citizen of the US and Australia. So, yeah, born and raised in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania. And my background in academics is in exercise science. So I did bachelor's and master's degrees in the US. And then eventually I moved to Sydney, Australia to do a PhD in exercise physiology. And so that was what brought me to Australia. And now I live in Perth, Western Australia, which is on the complete other side of the country than Sydney.
Gotcha. Do you know Bathurst?
Bathurst is on the East Coast. I think it's in New South Wales, the state of New South Wales.
Gotcha. Okay. I talked to Dr. Denny Solikowski from there. I think she's
Yep.
on the opposite side of the continent from you.
Yeah. No, I know Danny. And actually, Danny and I met in person for the first time last November. We both attended the Australians for Science and Freedom conference. And
Very cool.
yeah. So it's a new group. It's been around for the past couple of years. It came out of the whole COVID era as sort of a pushback to some of what was happening in academia at that time. And I was invited to talk about my academic cancellation story there. They had a whole session on that topic, and then also some of the men's health research. And I had an opportunity to meet Danny and talk with her.
That's fascinating. Let's start on some of this exercise science, because I remember hearing you talk about just fascinating studies like grip strength and these different type of things. What did you learn about exercise science?
Well, my background is more in strength training. So, you've got your aerobic or cardiovascular exercise, but then you also have the strength training component, which focuses more on your nervous system and your muscular system. So, my PhD research was actually about so we know that, your muscles get stronger when you do strength training, but then the question is, well, how? How does that happen? And some people might say, oh, well, your muscles get bigger and that's how you get stronger. And that's partly true. But actually, another thing that happens is that your brain and your spinal nerves get better at communicating with your muscle to allow it to activate the muscle fibers better. And that's a property called voluntary activation. It's how well you can voluntarily drive your own muscle. So anyways, that's the sort of stuff that I used to study. And now the grip strength stuff you're mentioning, I got into that because we have heaps and heaps of data on grip strength. It's the most commonly measured strength measurement in the world. And I looked at it from a perspective of this whole ongoing debate about sex differences in strength and performance. And I recently published a big meta-analysis on how the sex difference in grip strength is there very consistently, even prior to puberty. And then after puberty, you just get a huge difference. So this, of course, relates to the whole transgender sports debate.
So that would, I think their argument is if someone goes on HRT, there would be no, and in fact, I've seen quite a few publications saying this. If a male goes on HRT, they would have no advantage over a biological female in sports. And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's not true. The the strength differences are already there prior to puberty, and that's one thing that that grip strength study shows. And I've even published a second paper which compiles all other strength measurements from all other muscle groups in the body in kids, and it's there in all the other muscle groups as well. So it's most prominent in the upper body muscles. Um, and this is really important because even in adults, the sex difference in muscle strength is always greatest in upper body muscles, whereas men still have an advantage in the lower body muscles, but the sex difference closes. The reason is biology. It's because men carry a greater proportion of their muscle mass and their total body mass in their upper bodies, whereas women disproportionately carry a greater proportion of their muscle mass in their lower bodies. So that helps to kind of narrow the strength difference. But that even applies to some degree in children as well. So these differences are there prior to puberty. Uh, Greg Brown, who's at one of the branch campuses of the University of Nebraska, has shown prepubertal sex differences in various athletic performances like 100-meter sprint time and these types of things. So that argument just doesn't fly because the differences are already there to a certain degree before puberty, anyways.
What was the response to this research?
I think most people appreciated it, and it's now being cited in the Supreme Court cases. And uh, actually, I posted about this. One of the on the side of more of the trans activist groups, they actually misrepresented my research in one of their amicus briefs, and I wrote a post about that, correcting it. So you'll have groups that try to come at it in certain ways, but oftentimes they misinterpret what you say, or they don't even understand what your graphs are showing. But the vast majority of people have been supportive of that work. And what's amazing is that those data have been out there for so long and so much of it, but it's only become kind of more prominent now because of this particular debate we're having. But we've had these data for years just sitting there, but published in kind of a different context.
Mm, wow. Was there much blowback aside from the trans thing? Was there like a feminist blowback saying, that you're kind of making the claim that men are superior to women?
Well, feminists are divided on this issue. It has really shown how non-objective they've been from the very beginning, because you have some who they're in a bind. They are in a bind because, on one hand, if you if you if you say if you don't want men and women's sports, you are implicitly admitting that men have greater performance levels than women, and it's not socially constructed. That is to say, it's biological. On the other hand, they also want to be inclusive, and so they're kind of torn on that issue because normally you can't have it both ways. So it's really torn the feminists apart. Where I think some of the older school feminists are on the side of keeping men out of women's sports, but you sort of have this more kind of new age younger group, the younger women, who I don't know what it is. I don't know if they don't have experience in playing sport or what, but they're more on the side of transgender inclusiveness.
Hmm. Uh, when you say they're on the side of transgender inclusive, how does that manifest in like how they respond to this issue?
Well, I don't personally get too much blowback, to be honest, from sort of trans activists. So I don't know. I don't think this issue is going to continue on much longer. I mean, it depends what the Supreme Court decision ends up being. I just think it's a losing argument. I don't think people are going to continue down this pathway.
Hmm.
much longer. But I don't know, could be wrong.
Yeah. I hope you're right. I hope you're right. Tell me about your cancellation in academia.
Yeah, so I was employed at Edith Cowan University here in Western Australia, and I had sort of a weird position there where I was kind of casually employed, but then also I was also an adjunct when I was working outside in industry rather than at the university. So I had a couple of different like roles there over the past few years, and what I was essentially canceled over were my views on sex and gender, broadly speaking, criticisms of feminists and feminist theory, advocating for men's health, these types of things. So I have documented all this quite extensively at my Substack. Um, I was under the impression I was being canceled, like because of stories that were told to me, and so after my adjunct position was not renewed there, which was a bit surprising in the sense that I have a very strong publication record and ongoing collaborations there. And stories that have been told to me. I submitted a Freedom of Information request because it's a public university, so they have to take on these Freedom of Information requests if they receive them. And sure enough, I got back some pretty damning emails that showed that they were scheming to cancel me for a couple of years. It had been an ongoing thing, and it's all shown in all the emails which I've published publicly. They did not like what I was writing on X, and they did not like what I was writing in a couple of essays that I'd been asked to write for other venues. So this university is a highly feminized university, which is guided by something called the Athena Swan program, which I don't think has made it to the U.S. yet, but essentially Athena Swan is a sort of gender equality or gender equity accreditation system that started in the UK. And what they're doing is they're just shoving feminist theory through the universities here and creating substantial bias against men in the process. So this university was all in on this Athena Swan program. So anyone that stepped out of line from that thinking um, was, in my case, canceled. And they even explicitly mention that in the emails that I've found through the Freedom of Information request.
What are some topics that you were writing about that got them so upset?
Yeah, so there were two essays in particular that they cite because they're cited in the emails. In terms of the social media activity, I don't know specifically because that was never linked in any of the emails they were communicating with each other about. But one of them was an interview that I did with John Barry from the Center for
Yeah.
Male Psychology in the UK. And that interview covered a variety of topics. And then another one was a piece that I wrote for the Martin Center for Academic Renewal, which is based in North Carolina, and it's a group just focused on higher education reform and making all that better. And what bothered them from both of those pieces, because the interview with John Barry was a written interview, is that I was talking about the problems of quote unquote gender equity in exercise science and the sort of philosophical kind of issues with it and how it didn't sort of match up with logical argumentation. So that is what my university did not like. And I will add quickly that I have actually published peer reviewed papers on these topics. So they were canceling for something that I had a couple years earlier already gotten through peer review in a journal article. So it was very, um, it was a pretty disgraceful thing what they did.
Can you get into a little bit of your critique of the gender equity thing? Because what I've heard you talk about is it's just so fascinating to me. It seems like when I hear your side of it, it seems like a no-brainer argument, but they seem to be so offended by it.
Yeah, so it kind of depends which aspect. So there's the whole like sports aspect where you get into a lot of the whole sort of gender equity stuff there, where just quick example. So at a population level, if you measure physical activity rates, men tend to be more likely to meet physical activity guidelines than women. So then what they would say is, oh, we need to like sort of focus all of our efforts on women. And I don't think that should necessarily be the case. So that's sort of in sort of the exercise science realm there. You get all sorts of issues about this claim that women are underrepresented in research studies, that whole thing. Um, but then broadly speaking, like the Athena Swan program, what it does is um, it essentially it starts to get into this realm of really promoting female careers. So so doing anything in their power to just promote women, including like female only hiring practices, which happened in Australia uh, in when was that? Maybe around 2021. Various universities went down that road, and that was guided by Athena Swan. Um, they have the main funding body here that's equivalent to sort of the NIH in the US. They have now institutionalized gender quotas into their funding of researchers. So what was happening is that the male researchers were putting in better applications, they were getting rated higher and consequently getting more of the funding, and they didn't like that. So what they've now done is they've put in gender quotas so that there's equal funding for male and female researchers, but it's discriminatory because on merit based, the male researchers are putting in better applications, and they know that. So they are involved in active forms of discrimination, and then anyone that tries to call them out for it, they just get rid of.
Mm.
And it's all under this sort of disguise of kind of gender equity, or they make it sound like a sort of a really kind of humanitarian, egalitarian thing, but it actually involves active discrimination against men.
Yeah, that's that's fascinating. And it also seems odd because it looks like if you had a huge like representative sample of the population, and a lot of these areas women are doing better, but if you narrow it down to this one specific topic where women might not be doing as well, and you kind of blow that up, look how women are being discriminated against, and they have it so hard, it seems to misrepresent what's really going on with gender.
That's right. A perfect example of this is in academia. So I think you probably know, women now make up about 60% of graduates. They now make up the majority of academic staff, including now over 50% of faculty. So when you throw the admin staff on top of that, it gets even bigger. But what they do, even though you have all this evidence showing how decent women have it within the academic world, they focus in on the narrow topic of the most senior level faculty, where I still think women do make up less than 50%. And so anything that comes out in that space focuses, like you said, on that very niche part. But what they do is they continually move the goalposts. So once that goal gets accomplished, 50 or more percent women in the senior level professorships, they're just going to move the goalpost. So they'll find something else to go on about. And if you spend enough time studying sort of their techniques and what they go on about, you see there's basically no boundary, is what I'm saying. They just continue to move the goalposts.
I've heard you talk about how there's like this huge push for gender equity when it comes to like women's health. And when you look at it, women already outlive men, and we already spend more on women's health than men's health. What do you see there?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest myths I've been trying to bust over the past couple of years. So they're all kind of connected. So one of them is that women are underrepresented in clinical trials as the participants in the research. So that's one myth. The other myth is that women's health is underfunded. And and then kind of related to that, oh, we don't care about women's health. So none of that is true. Um, if you go, and I've published these data on my Substack. So in the early 1990s, because of these claims, which even at the time were not even true, but because of these claims in the early 90s, the NIH created the Office of Research on Women's Health. That office has quantified all these things ever since, and their data are publicly available, and people continue to ignore those data. So, what those data show is that when it comes to NIH funded research trials, women have made up more than 50% of participants every single year since like 1993, other than in like 2016. There was 1 year where where women were not over 50%. I think on the average, they end up being between 55 and 60% of participants in clinical trials. The other thing is there's been the entire Office for Research on Women's Health dedicated towards studying women's health. There are multiple other offices that have existed, like within the FDA. And if you look at the NIH's funding data, more more money is spent on female specific research than male specific research. So if you divide up the NIH's annual budget, about 80% of it is not sex specific, but of the remaining 20% that is sex specific, about 13% of that goes towards women's health and about 7% goes towards men's health. And it is roughly the same trend in Australia. So in Australia, every year they spend like 5 times more money on the equivalent of the NIH on funding of women's health research. But they continue to push this narrative, and it's just not true.
That's so bizarre to me because there's this concerted marketing campaign. Women's health is underfunded. You hear it like a drumbeat. And then I hardly ever run into people like you who are saying, wait a second, that's actually not what's going on.
Yeah, it's just so not true. Like the NIH has the data. I've published the data. Um, but one thing they do to try to keep that narrative alive, there's a couple things. So one is they don't ever mention men's health. So they just completely suppress like the life expectancy difference. They don't, when they present the women's health funding numbers, for example, they don't actually show you the comparative men's health funding numbers, right?
Mhm.
So you have no way to know unless you're a researcher like me and you dive into the NIH's spreadsheets, right? So that's one thing they do. The other thing that the women's health movement does, and by the way, I'm all for women's health. This is not against women's health. It's against the bias in the narratives. So what they do now, because the life expectancy difference, in the U.S. is men live about 5.5 years less life expectancy. So you might think that's reason to focus on men. But what they do is they change the narrative to not be about life expectancy. So what they do now is they move to um, quality of life years lived, right? And to sort of show you what this looks like. So a woman develops arthritis later on in life, right? So she lives longer, but she lives a lot of years in disability because of her arthritis. That's sort of what they're quantifying. But what they what they don't tell you is like the 28-year-old male who dies by suicide never lives long enough to develop arthritis. So they completely bias this whole narrative. They've been doing it for 30 years, Ryan. They continually move the goalposts and they try to pick out niche areas. This, by the way, might be changing because as of this week, legislation has been put forward in the US Congress to finally create an Office of Men's Health within the Department of Health and Human Services. Um, Previous efforts have been made to do that. They've all failed. This one seems to have a little bit more support behind it from the American Medical Association, the Men's Health Network, who's always kind of behind these efforts, and a few other groups. So I do think this is shifting a little bit.
Mm. That is exciting that there's some movement on this, but this level of bias seems so pervasive. Where is the root of this? Is it academia? Where's the origin?
Yes, it's academia. I also think, I'm a little bit sort of empathetic in the sense that I think we're probably biologically geared up to want to help women more than men. But we're at a level in our development where we can step back from potential biases like that might be a little bit more kind of ingrained and say, wait a minute, how do how does what we kind of feel match up with what the evidence, shows? And I don't think people are when you look at journalists kind of writing about this topic, they don't ever refer to NIH data. They don't ever refer to the data that we actually have, and no one holds them accountable for that. So, like, that's one way that they're able to keep up the narrative because they're never like until I don't know, me sort of coming along and actually actively posting these graphs like every single week on X. No one was really pointing out the data that show the contrary.
Is it like a clickbait thing, like women's health underfunded, try to go viral? Like what's the motivation here for for the journalists, for instance?
I don't necessarily think it's clickbait. I think they actually believe it. And I think they actually believe it because they don't know the data, and then they're just inheriting the other narratives around them. So they're just going with what they believe to be true, based off of that. And that's why I think it's so important to get the data out there, and why I keep trying to like hammer it home every time another article comes out. I just post the graph. I post the graph that shows that women have not been underrepresented in these clinical trials. It's an interesting, experience, maybe for someone that has like psychology training to just see how when people are presented with that evidence, they then quickly shift the narrative to be about something slightly different. But they would have been more than happy to carry on with that narrative had I not presented the graph. So they just do these kind of slight changes to maintain sort of female victimization status.
It feels like almost a big part of their identity is caught up in this. Part of who I am involves fighting the patriarchy and standing up for the victimized woman who's downtrodden and has been shoved aside by this male dominated society. Like that's so ingrained as part of like who I am, my identity, that when you show these graphs, it's like I'm not even going to see that. Is that how you are seeing it?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what happens. And like I said, they just will quickly shift. It's sort of like a little. It's sort of subtle. They want to maintain the female victim status, but they just shift it. So some of them are good at they're like, oh wow, this guy just sort of presented this graph that completely refutes. So they then shift that narrative. And again, I think the end goal is to just always maintain, for whatever reason. I don't know what the reason is to maintain that female victimization status or just to disparage men in some way. By the way, another thing that never gets pointed out in this whole narrative about research trials and everything is to the extent that men have been, overrepresented in previous decades of research, there's this assumption that being a research participant in the 1950s or 60s would have been desirable. But they were doing a lot of different experimentation back then, especially in my sort of area of like applied physiology. So this was the era of taking pilots in the Air Force and submitting them to really high G forces such that they black out during the experiment. And those types of nuances are never acknowledged because had women actually been a greater percentage of participants back then, let's say they were 65% of all participants in medical trials from the 40s through the 60s, do you know what they'd be saying now? They would be saying, look at how you used and abused the female body for medical experimentation. So the the take home message is either way, you can't get it right, right? So they're just trying. They will take whatever data you have and spin it to be about female victimization status.
This seems representative of so many conversations in the broader social cultural environment where everything's a double bind. You use female participants, you're using us as guinea pigs. You don't use female participants, why are you excluding us?
That's
There's
right.
there's no right way to go about this.
That's right. Yeah, and unless maybe somehow you magically got it 50-50 right from the start. I think that's maybe the only way, but I'm still not convinced. I don't know what excuse they would come up with to make that a bad thing, but somehow they would make that into a bad thing.
So I've heard you talk about the side of academia with the research, from IRB to the peer-reviewed journals. Like, the whole process sounds corrupt. What can you tell me about that pipeline of how research gets published?
Okay, so let's say you're a university researcher, you come up with a new idea. The first thing you have to do is submit it to your local ethics committee. And so normally that each university will have an ethics board that meets like once a month or once every 2 months to review ethics applications. Uh, the whole purpose of an ethics board is just to make sure that the research being conducted on campus is safe for the people that are going to participate in it. Unfortunately, what's happened there is even those bodies are now starting to be corrupt by different ideologies. They're becoming increasingly bureaucratic and making it more and more difficult to do research. But let's say you get past that point and you conduct a study and then you write it up. The next step is to submit it to an academic journal for peer review. Peer review is an absolute disaster right now, and everyone that participates in it knows it. There's many layers of problems. So one of them is that we've got more and more research than we've ever had. So there's a huge number of submissions to be reviewed at journals and too few people to review the papers. So normally, a given paper will be reviewed by at least two peer reviewers, if not more than that. Journals are struggling to find peer reviewers because it is a crazy, messed up system. And that is that the peer reviewers do not actually get compensated for their time in reviewing papers. Even though most journals now are published by for-profit publishers, academics are so, I don't know what word to use here, that they for years have participated in this system where they're essentially getting used and abused. Like they're doing free labor for profit publishers. And finally, what's happened is that some have woken up to that and are now tapping out of the peer review system, at least for profit publishers. It's created a huge backlog of submissions that are taking. I've had papers take 1 to 2 years to finally get published after I first submitted them. And even then, you have substantial bias in peer review as well, because various academics have their own agendas. So there's just many, many layers, and it's due to just be exploded. It's in the process of something happening because it's not tenable. It can't go on like it is anymore, and people are fed up with it. I don't know what the sort of revolutionary change is going to be. I would sort of prefer a more open system where you just, once you finish your paper, you just publish. I don't know, maybe each university sets up its own kind of publication and it just gets published like a book on Amazon, and then people just write reviews of the paper in the Amazon comments or something, right? I don't know that it needs to go through this process anymore. People can, I don't know, give the paper ratings from 1 to 10 stars. They can comment on it. We need something different. It's also not fair to taxpayers because most um, research is publicly funded one way or another. And for me to conduct a study and know the knowledge in my head and then not have that come out to the public for 2 more years, like that's absurd. Like
Mm.
that knowledge should be out there as soon as possible. So that's the state of academic peer review. It's very ugly, and it's also not working because you can see how much rubbish gets published in the journals. So it's not, even the current system is not sort of quality checking properly.
Yeah, I want to talk about what kind of political bias you're seeing in these journals, because I'm sure you're familiar with the Pluckrose, Bogosian, Lindsay, Hoax Studies papers, and you might look at that and think, okay, the grievance studies disciplines are kind of a joke. We shouldn't take this too seriously because those are not serious academic disciplines. But what are you seeing in like physiology and the hard sciences in terms of political bias?
Yeah, I definitely think people should take those things seriously, the grievance studies stuff, because what has happened is, so that's mostly in the humanities journals, right? The sociology journals, the social work, psychology to a certain degree, gender studies for sure, right? But what's happened is that those ideas have trickled in to the more scientific fields. The way that it's gotten into the health and medical literature is, in my opinion, through public health. So public health kind of has like one foot sort of in the humanity, like sociology, and then another foot kind of in medicine. And it's a pathway by which those ideas are coming over into fields like exercise science or nursing or general medicine. And the way that you know this, I've published graphs showing this, is if you go to PubMed, which is one of the main databases for indexing biomedical and health research, and you type in a word like social justice, health equity, misogyny, feminism, whatever, you get a lot of hits. So, and those, PubMed is not really indexing many of the humanities journals. It's mostly the medical and health sciences. And so you can see that those ideas that started in the humanities have worked their way over into these other fields.
Mm. Wow. What are some type of things that you're seeing in your like the health world that seem like they're putting a pretty heavy thumb on the scale?
Well, it's anything that is sort of against heterosexual white males. That is what is the most popular. And that continues on. I think we maybe have passed the peak of that. I'm not quite sure. It's still prominent, but maybe we've gotten past the peak of what I call woke medicine. And that's see another name for that, by the way, too, a kind of more academic name that's been around for a very long time. People don't realize this. It's called the social determinants of health. Um,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so that phrase in and of itself um, might seem a little bit more kind of reasonable, but if you study the history of that movement, it started in the World Health Organization in the early 2000s, and it was always framed under the equity framework, and it always excluded men's health. In the sort of gender sex section, it was always focused on women's health, for example. So what public health has done is they've gone to, well, the whole public health is, I guess, by nature, always focused on kind of group level data, but they have really, really focused on group level data almost exclusively, and they have sort of gotten away from this individualized or personalized medicine approach, which focuses just on the individual patient, no matter what their race is, their sex, whatever. You just focus on individual patients and you go from there. That has just gone out the window, and it's all about what is their racial identity, what's their gender identity, and then that determines, I guess, what sort of approach you take. So that's woke medicine. It's linked up with the social determinants of health because social determinants is there's three main things that affect health. There's social environmental stuff, there's biology, so what you're born with, and then there's sort of the choices you make in that framework. The social determinants of health pretends like the other areas don't exist, and it tries to monopolize everything to be all about social and environmental factors. this is very handy for the people that put this narrative forward because it ties in heavily with funding from the NIH and stuff. So if you are of the belief that individual people's health is strictly determined by, I don't know, the built environment or whatever else, then you just dump all the funding into that area, which you think you can kind of socially engineer society for better health outcomes. Now, that might be true to a certain extent, but what they've done is they've really, really minimized the role of the individual and personal health decisions and personal behavior within the health framework.
Hmm. So, kind of along these lines, something tell me if you see this. It feels a lot like if there's any metric, whether it's health, education, anything like that, where women are falling behind, it's the system that's to blame. But if men are falling behind, then it's men's fault. They must be too dumb to catch up in education, or too unthoughtful to take care of their health. Whatever it is, do you see that?
Absolutely. It's a great observation. Happens all the time. It's partly what's driving all of this madness right now. Uh, women, women's health is like exclusively determined by social environmental factors. Women have no kind of volition or sort of free will or agency, whatever you want to call it, to determine their health. And that's why they push so hard for all this funding into the structural factors affecting women's health and all that. And then why they don't push the same thing for men's health, right? And yeah, it's a completely biased scenario that they have created.
I think if you turn feminism on its head, you might look at this and say they're denying agency and autonomy to women by saying that they don't have choice in this matter.
That's right. And I do not understand why more women do not get offended by that. It's a very fascinating phenomenon. I do think, and you might be more familiar with this literature, if I'm not mistaken, if you survey both men and women, I think they both believe that men actually have more agency than women. Do you know if that is
No,
true?
I haven't seen that. That's interesting,
I
though.
yeah, I think I've seen that research before. So there is some, and I suspect it is a greater belief among women that they actually feel that they don't have as much agency as men feel. Men are much more like self-confident, and that kind of, I think, links in with agency. And actually, that in terms of kind of male psychology, that can actually be, I think, detrimental to men's health sometimes they because then they don't seek help when they need it. So that kind of social or environmental thing that might be able to assist them, they want to try to work through the problem themselves, which is completely fine until it's not fine. Like until like you keep running up against the wall and are unable to help yourself, it's okay to get help from others. And I think that's why also why women are part of why they're more likely to seek help is because they sort of are less likely to feel like they're in control of their own agency or destiny, and that those social and environmental factors, yeah, are there for them.
That's so interesting. I wonder if that those tendencies are like hardwired, ingrained. If that could be why you see more of a like an individualist streak among men, a more collectivist streak among women. Do you think so?
I think so. I think it is. And I think all this stuff is super fascinating. And we need to be able to talk about it openly. Like all this research on sex differences in psychology, I think it's not only important just for studying like understanding human nature, but I think it does actually have like clinical implications. But what has happened in academia is because of this cancel culture, we now have difficulty actually talking about these things in the open way that you and I are because people get offended. If you say something like, I don't know, women believe they have less agency or something, even if it's shown in a study, they still get triggered by that. So, this is why I think it's really important to continue to have these discussions because I think ultimately it can help both, yeah, men and women.
Hmm. So I've heard you talk about like the World Economic Forum and the UN and their initiatives around gender equity. What can you tell me about that?
Oh gosh, the UN is an absolute disaster, and that's why you have seen recently the United States withdraw some of its funding from the UN. Israel as well has withdrawn funding. One of the agencies, the one that I pay the most attention to, which was on the list um, of the agencies that the US was no longer going to fund or was going to significantly cut back funding, is UN Women. So UN Women is guided by feminist intersectional theory. They're explicit about that. It's in their documentation. So it's already a problem from the start because there's many holes in those theories. And so I've done some analysis of the UN where I've quantified their substantial anti-male bias, and I've also quantified the and kind of captured the way they go about propaganda on X. And so it's a very problematic group, UN Women is, and I hope that I wish it would just change. I wish it would just listen to feedback. In my opinion, the UN, if you're going to have a UN Women, you should have a UN Men. Probably, I wish there was no UN Women or UN Men, and maybe no UN at all, because it's, that whole organization is just completely captured by a certain ideology. It pumps out the same no matter what, because the UN has many different, like, sub-agencies, and no matter which one you follow, it's the same alarmist rhetoric in all their tweets. It's the same ideology. They are not politically neutral at all. So either you change your way or we just completely defund you. That's my approach with the UN after studying them for a couple years now.
Some of these things, like the UN, you should take what you think a stronger stance on, like female genital mutilation in Sudan, for instance. You think that would be like a one to really lay down the law on, but instead it's like kind of like your upper middle class women in the West, kind of like boutique issues. Does it feel like that?
Yeah, a little bit. It's kind of a weird organization in the sense that um, they focus on, or at least their social media presence, they'll focus on a couple things that might kind of be like, oh, okay, so they're focused in on women in Afghanistan, for example, which you look at that, okay, yeah, yeah, I can get on board with that. And then they might focus on, Sudan and a couple of other places. But then it's not entirely clear what exactly they're accomplishing. And to the extent they are accomplishing some things, it just has this other component of it, which is very generalized. So they sort of put out kind of these very general messages about, um, like, essentially how women across the world have it so bad. And that might be true for certain countries, but it is not true globally. And and in doing that, they go about lying. They suppress data related to male victimization. Like you mentioned, they do talk about female genital mutilation, but the UN actually promotes the male version of that, which is male circumcision. So they are a completely biased organization in the direction of favoring women and not talking about men's issues, and that's sort of the thing that I go on and on about.
It's kind of interesting. What came up for me is like there's very real human faces behind the pain. I think a lot of times it's dismissed. Well, we need to focus on women because men have all the privilege and they're doing just fine and dandy anyway. So they're not worth our time and attention. But there really are, like there's human faces and human suffering behind this disparity in who gets attention and who gets funding.
That's right. And the other silly thing about all this is, by helping men, you help women. Um, to the extent that men, have certain mental health difficulties or what have you, healthier men is a healthier society. It's healthier relationships with women. It's healthier relationships with their kids. It's healthier relationships with colleagues at work. And that's sort of how you know that it's more about ideology than helping people, because it's not looking at it from that type of perspective where you would say, oh, look, our end goal is really just is to make everyone's lives better and the world better and human flourishing. It's not. It's very ideological. So it's like we're starting from a standpoint that we are only interested in women, and we will continue to push whatever narrative we have to keep that going, rather than just having empathy for all potential, victims of abuse or disadvantage.
Hmm. So I've got three questions left for you. And the first one is, what is the best way we can improve men's health outcomes?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah, that's one I kind of debate a little bit, because I'm not sure at this point how much things like creating men's health offices will help. I think it would help from the standpoint of what it reflects more broadly, which is the culture is changing. That is, it's becoming more acceptable to talk about men's health, broadly speaking, and that there can be scenarios in which men are not doing so well and disadvantaged and all that. Um, so I think the first thing is getting rid of the anti-male narratives, the misandry, the discrimination, the discriminatory hiring practices, which, by the way, have implications for the men who are not hired, right, in those positions, which might make them well off financially and all that. Um, I think that's sort of the first step, is really trying to combat the biased narratives, and then that just creates a more kind of calm, level playing field for having more rational discussions.
Mm, I like that answer. Um, what is the best way we can improve the quality of academic research?
Oh boy. Okay. Step number one, you have to define what the purpose of a university is.
Mm,
That will then tell you who are the most qualified people to hire to work there. What I mean by that is, right now, the purpose of the university is mixed, and it's mixed in a bad way. So, the old school way, the traditional purpose was to advance human knowledge, right? And to transmit a set of knowledge to the next generation of people. That's changing. We now know that social justice, DEI stuff, activism, political activism is now a component of the purpose of the university. Whether they state that explicitly, and some do, that is becoming a purpose. That those two purposes cannot go together, because the woke DEI stuff it does not involve rigorous research or logical rational thinking. So you cannot have those two purposes together. You have to decide which way you want to go. Once you decide which way you want to go, then it tells you who's the most appropriate person to hire. Um, if you can stick to the more traditional purpose and just hire people based off of that purpose, then you'll get good quality researchers and educators, right? But if you keep having this mixed purpose and this activism aspect, you're just continually going to have all of these uh, junk papers that myself and Colin Wright at Reality's Last Stand publish about all the time. So that, I would say, is kind of the fundamental step, and that should, in theory, also create a more heterodox academy, so more viewpoint diversity, which would also help in just kind of people, critiquing each other's ideas from different perspectives to ultimately give us the best knowledge in the end.
that's interesting because I think from a lot of the social justice activist perspective, it just seems common sense, like almost like a cosmic quest for justice, to borrow from Thomas Sowell. Like we're saving humanity, we're saving planet Earth. What could possibly be more important than that? Just gaining knowledge seems like a minuscule goal in compared to what we're shooting for. But at the same time, I feel like the market has to respond at some point and say, that's nice that you have these lofty goals, but we're paying an ungodly sum of money to get an education there, and I want a good job after I graduate. That part's more important to me than climate change or gender equity or dismantling cis heteronormativity. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think this is all foundational stuff. We got to get back to just what the facts are and then go from there. But what's happening is because these individuals are being hired who are more activist in their outlook or aims, they are rigging the research process. So I've written about this at Reality's Last Stand. The piece is called, I don't know, How Woke Academics Are Rigging Research. And what they are doing is they are developing like survey tools. They are conducting interviews, focus groups in which they already know what their conclusion is going to be. So it doesn't matter what the men in the fathers group say in the interview. If it's led by like a hardcore feminist, it doesn't matter. It when you have a biased survey tool like the toxic masculinity scale that came out last year, it's rigged from the start. So this is where I'm saying the universities have to make a decision. Which way do we want to go? Do we value objective reality and actual knowledge, or do we just want to be a bunch of activists?
Kind of this rigging the research before you even conduct the research. To me, that's the essence of critical theory. It goes back to the quote from Karl Marx: "The philosophers have only tried to understand the world. The point is to change it." You know, this whole like we're acquiring knowledge. They would look at that as like hopelessly naive. You know, if activism isn't driving your research, then they would view your research as pointless. Like if you haven't discovered the conclusion before you do the research, to them that would be odd because it's like you don't have the proper direction. Like they would see this like completely 180 from us.
Yeah, I agree. I have a piece which I think is going to be published next month, and I actually think it is unethical from a human research standpoint for them to be conducting this research because it's not actually research. It's not science. It's not research. In order for it to qualify as that, it has to be falsifiable. But it's not falsifiable um, because no matter what data they receive from the participants in the interviews or focus groups or the survey, they are always going to come to the same conclusion, which is that white people are ignorant of their racism, or these men in the fathers group, they're ignorant of this or that. They were always going to conclude that from the very start of the research, no matter what the participants said. So I've written this piece, which is currently being considered an outlet, which I make the case that these studies should never even be approved by those ethics boards that we talked about, because it's not actually research, and therefore it puts people at increased risk of harm, which is what the ethics board are supposed to be looking at. So what I'm trying to say is that there was no reason for the people ever to be submitted to that research study, because the researcher was going to reach the same conclusion no matter what. So I'm trying to reframe this whole thing as actually being unethical. And I don't know, hopefully that catches on a little bit, because that would be a really core fundamental thing that could be changed to stop this. And I don't want to stop it just for the sake of stopping it or anything like that. It's actually just not research. It's not what it says it is, and it uses the prestige associated with universities and getting through ethics boards and getting published in a journal. It gives us this sort of prestige of being legitimate academic research, but it's not. It was completely rigged from the start.
I talked to Lee Jussum. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. But he talked about, I think it's called pre-registering your hypothesis. So you go to, I don't know if it's IRB or who you go to, but you say, hey, this is the research we're going to do, and this is our hypothesis, so that you couldn't later on say, oh, we discovered no racism, which is proof that white people are go to great lengths to hide their racism. Like you have to say this is what we're shooting for ahead of time. Does that make sense?
Yep, yep. So that is becoming a little bit more popular, pre-registration. I don't know that that's going to resolve a lot of the issues that we have. It might resolve some of them, like maybe the ones that you mentioned there.
So my final question is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I would say these legitimate discussions on sex differences in psychology, sex differences in preferences like work life preferences, sex differences in interests in different things like sports and all this stuff. We keep pretending, or certain people in academia keep pretending that men and women are the same, they're meant to be the same, or it's kind of like actually more like this. It's more like women are any of the good aspects that men bring, but they're even better. They're morally superior and better in every other way. We can't keep going down this road. Men and women are meant to work together. We are meant to be compatible and go through all this together based off of our, yes, we have a lot of shared common interests and characteristics, but we also have things that make us different, and that's okay because we are both better off when we go forward together with both our similarities and our differences. So I think we just need to be more honest in recognizing those and really try to like, I know I talk a lot about the sex and gender stuff, but I'm doing it because I want it to calm down. I want it to get back to more of a neutral level. I think we'll all be much better off when that happens.
Hmm. I love that answer, and I love this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, and I would talk to you again anytime.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my book, The Woke Mind, The Twisted Psychology of the Social Justice Movement, available on Amazon.